A trusted voice of truth and light.
God gave me a gift. I shovel well. I shovel very well.
And a rally point for those who've accepted the reality that they are not sheep.
We've got a blind date with destiny.
And it looks like she's ordered the lobster.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
Well, hello there, and welcome to the show. This program exists for the purpose of encouraging you to think as clearly and independently as you possibly can. You see, truth isn't something that's handed to us by an authority figure. If you're serious about understanding the world as it really is, well, that means you're going to have to go after the truth yourself. I'm not saying that I will hand it all to you. I'll just, dump a bucket full of it in your lap. No, I'm actually just going to point you in the right direction and let you continue that journey until you're satisfied you understand things as best you can. So, in other words, you don't have to agree. That's never a necessity or an implied, agreement. Well, now, you listen to the show, so therefore you have to, defer to everything I say. I want to make you think, but I sure don't want to tell you what to think. So, with those ground rules in mind, let's get started today. Great sponsors make this show possible, including Dixie Chiropractic, HSL Ammo, Sewing and Quilting Center, also Monticello College, Life Saving Food, the Heather Turner team at Patriot Home Mortgage, and GovernYourCrypto.com. You'll find a nice link to each one of these sponsors in my show notes, which you'll find at thebryanhydeshow.com. So I saw a clip yesterday of Dr. Fauci, and I don't know who he was being questioned by. It looked like he was being, I guess he was being questioned by some kind of official legislative committee. And it was just a short little clip, but his attitude sparked something in me that I was like, oh, man. I try to live my life with as little hatred or as little contempt for other people as possible. And then I see a clip of Dr. Fauci saying, why are we even talking about lockdowns? We never locked down. China locked down, but we never locked down. And I think to myself, man, somebody could make Dr. Fauci Christmas ornaments, and I bet they would sell like hotcakes. Not because everybody loves Dr. Fauci all that much, but just because the sight of him hanging there on the tree would just, I don't know, it might make some people feel better. Nonetheless, that's the closest I came to feeling some full-on just hate for the guy. I was just fed up with that smarmy, I'm a bureaucrat, I know what's best for you attitude. And to sit there and question, well, we never locked down. Why are we even talking about lockdowns? That's tough. It stirs an anger in me that I sometimes don't even know is there until it starts to surface. And I don't want to live with hatred in my heart or in my mind. Now, keeping your heart and mind free from hatred, that's a pretty serious undertaking. But it's a very worthwhile undertaking. And I want to start off today with an essay from Barry Brownstein. This is from his Mindset Shifts Substack. Hatred will destroy you. What the Holodomor teaches us today. Very important historical lesson here, but an even more important sentiment about don't let hate dictate, who you are. Don't let that be the definition of how you define yourself. Well, this is what I'm against. Barry Brownstein writes, the Holodomor, or death by hunger, is the name given to the 1930s terror famine in Ukraine. Now, leading up to the famine were the murder and exile of Ukrainian farmers, kulaks, and the collectivization of farms under Stalin. Robert Conquest, in his book Harvest of Sorrows, lays out the sequence of events, quote, a famine which struck all the grain-producing areas of European Russia, and especially Ukraine, reached a climax in the summer of 1933. It began years earlier, however, when Stalin, in the winter of 1929 and 1930, dispossessed, exiled, and killed millions of the more prosperous peasants and harassed the remaining peasantry into surrendering land, animals, and tools into collective farms. It was made inevitable in the second and final wave of collectivization in the winter of 1930 to 1931, when a disorganized and disillusioned peasantry was effectively enslaved. End quote. Now, the death toll was beyond imaginable. Conquest writes of a Ukrainian farm population between 20 and 25 million. About 5 million died. That's a quarter to a fifth of the population there. The casualty rate varied considerably by area and even village, from 10% to 100%. Time after time, officials tell of entering villages with few or no survivors and seeing the dead in their houses. In villages of 3,000 to 4,000 people, only 45 to 80 people were left. Now, Barry Brownstein says, to learn from the Holodomor, I turned to the remarkable Russian novelist and journalist Vasily Grossman. Grossman's perhaps the greatest freedom fighter you've never heard of. He exposed the common roots of the totalitarian horrors of communism and fascism, and he also revealed, with unparalleled insights, the mindset that ordinary people adopted to enable their oppressors. His novel, Life and Fate, is one of the outstanding novels of the 20th century. Barry Brownstein says, I've explored that novel in 4 previous essays. He has links to each one of them. Why good people enable totalitarians. It takes a village of bureaucrats to implement despotism. Why there's a civic and moral duty to oppose tyrannical bureaucracies. And a Soviet dissident explains American censorship. Now, up until his death in 1964, Grossman was writing his last novel and testament, Everything Flows. In it, Grossman delivers viscerally compelling narratives of the Holodomor. His insights reach us across time, warning of the consequences of events we can observe today. Today, we must learn from the past to prevent the worst tomorrow. So he says, as you read the following excerpts from Grossman's vivid description of the Holodomor, I offer these questions for reflection. Today, which groups of people are politicians, academics, experts, and the media teaching us to hate? What groups may be targeted during a future economic depression? What justifications for hatred are we adopting which normalizes the dehumanization of others? What consequences do you imagine are possible when groups of people are dehumanized? Now, the destruction begins with attacks. I hope you recognize, the significance here. If somebody starts proposing, we ought to tax the unvaccinated. Okay, listen to this. The murder and exile of the farmers began with a special tax. The kulaks believed complying with the tax would save them from further harm. Grossman writes, they paid up, somehow they found the money, then they were taxed a second time. Anything they could, they sold. They believed that if they paid up, the state would be merciful. So special taxes were the first step. Arrests followed, beginning with selected fathers of farming families. The village Soviets would then each draw up a list of names. It was on the basis of these lists that people were arrested. And who drew up the lists? Well, a group of 3, a troika. A group of 3 ordinary, muddle-headed people determined who was to live and who was to die. There were no holds barred. There were bribes. There were scores to be settled because of a woman or some other past grievance. Often it was the poorest peasants who were listed as kulaks, while the richer peasants managed to buy themselves off. And when it came to drawing up lists, the evil committed by the honest people was no less than the evil committed by the bad people. What matters is that the very existence of these lists was unjust and evil. After fathers, entire families were rounded up, the OGPU, a precursor to the KGB, couldn't do the job on its own, so party activists were mobilized too. Grossman tells the terrible tale. The activists were just villagers like anyone else, and they were people everyone knew. But they all seemed to lose their minds. They seemed dazed, crazed, as if they'd fallen under some spell. They threatened people with guns. They called small children kulak brats. You're bloodsuckers, they yelled, bloodsuckers. Now, the activists were ordinary villagers sympathetic to the state and convinced by state propaganda to hate their neighbors. Again, from Grossman's book, for the main part, the activists were people from our own village. They were admittedly under a spell. They'd convinced themselves that if the kulaks were evil, that it was best not to even touch them. They would not even sit down to eat with one of those parasites. The kulaks' towels were unclean, their children were disgusting, their young women were worse than lice. The activists looked on those who were being dispossessed as if they were cattle or swine. Everything about the kulaks was vile. They were vile in themselves. They had no souls. They stank. They were full of sexual diseases. And worst of all, they were enemies of the people and the exploiters of labor of others. Unaffected by the violence, Barry Brownstein says, that they inflicted, as they drove the kulaks from their homes, these activists could just as well have been driving a flock of geese down the road. Through the voice of one of his characters, Grossman explains the relentless Soviet propaganda. Destroy the kulaks and utopia will follow. Now, I got to tap the brakes here because we are coming up fast on a break, but we're going to come back to this in a few moments. And again, my goal here is not to generate hatred towards Stalin or the Russians or anybody else, not even towards the people who right now, at this moment, are working to oppress us, to convert us, the freedom-minded, into kulaks. This is more of a cautionary tale about don't be the kind of person who can be manipulated through hate or through fear to do the kind of things that were done in the Holodomor. I know it sounds easy, but like I related earlier, I was having a perfectly peaceful day and suddenly realized, wow, I'm grinding my teeth. Just from watching Dr. Fauci, make a inane statement. I got to do better.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show. This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
Hey, welcome back to the show. I want to mention the Heather Turner team at Patriot Home Mortgage, located in St. George, Utah. Although her specialty, her expertise, could extend to any of my listeners within the state of Utah or the state of Idaho. If you happen to be looking for a mortgage, from a VA loan to a traditional loan to a reverse mortgage, contact the Heather Turner team at Patriot Home Mortgage. They have the knowledge, the experience, the stability, and the clout to get you the loan you need without delay. Call 435-703-4522 for more information. Heather's NMLS ID is 715386, and Patriot Home Mortgage is an equal housing opportunity lender. So I'm continuing on with this this essay by Barry Brownstein, warning how hatred will destroy you, and what we can learn from the Holodomor today. Even though it took place back in the early 1930s, there's still some very valuable lessons. So this is how the excuse me, this is how the characters in Grossman's book describe the relentless propaganda. Destroy the kulaks, utopia will follow. He says, during meetings and special briefings from films, books, articles, and radio broadcasts from Stalin himself, I kept hearing one and the same thing: that kulaks are parasites, that kulaks burn bread and murder children. The fury of the masses had to be ignited against them. Yes, those were the words. It was proclaimed that the kulaks must be destroyed as a class, every accursed one of them. I, too, began to fall under this spell. It seems that every misfortune was because of the kulaks. If we were to annihilate them immediately, then happy days would dawn for us all. Now, Barry Brownstein says some of the activists were driven by hatred, others merely obeyed, still others sought to steal from their victims. Back to Grossman's book, there were all sorts among us, activists. There were those who truly believed, who hated the parasites, and who really did do all they could do for the poorest peasants. And there were those with selfish aims of their own, and then there were those, the majority, who were simply obeying orders, people willing to beat their own mothers and fathers to death if that was what they were told to do. The most terrible of all were not those who believed in the happy life that would set in after the kulaks were done away with. No, the beasts that seem wildest are not always the most dangerous. The most terrible of all were the ones with selfish aims of their own. They never stopped talking about political awareness, and all the time they were settling personal scores, stealing and plundering, destroying the lives of others. They destroyed others just to get a few possessions, for a mere pair of boots. Now, Barry Brownstein says it was chillingly easy to add a person to the list of kulaks to destroy. Just write a denunciation. You don't even have to put your signature to it. Just say that your neighbor owned 3 cows or that he had hired hands working for him, and there, you've set him up as a kulak. Villagers who survived the purging of the kulaks were not prepared for what followed. Now that there were no more kulaks, everyone was forced to join the collective farm. There were meetings that lasted all night long with endless cursing and shouting. Politics swamped all life. Rights were minimal under communism, but even those rights were stripped if they were used to the detriment of the socialist revolution. Having eliminated farmers whose knowledge and incentives produced bountiful harvests, the natural consequence was famine. And we all thought that no fate could be worse than that of the kulaks. How wrong we were. In the villages, the axe fell on everyone. No one was big enough or small enough to be safe. And Grossman explains how execution by famine started with lies. How did it all happen? After the dispossession of the kulaks, the area of land under cultivation dropped sharply, and so did the crop yield. But everyone kept reporting that without the kulaks, our life had immediately started to blossom. The village Soviet lied to the district to the province, and the province to Moscow. Everyone wanted Stalin to rejoice in the belief that a happy life had begun, and the whole of his dominion would soon be awash with collective farm grain. The time came for the first collective farm harvest. Everything seemed in order. Moscow determined the quotas for grain deliveries from each province, and the provinces determined the quota for each district. And our village was given a quota it couldn't have fulfilled in 10 years. Now, Barry Brownstein says unfilled quotas triggered Soviet reprisals. Where was it then, this ocean of collective farm grain? It must have been hidden away. Idlers, parasites, kulaks who had not yet been liquidated. Now, the kulaks had been deported, but their spirit endured. The Ukrainian peasant was enthralled to private property. State propaganda targeted a new group of peasants to hate, the sub-kulaks. Sub-kulaks were peasants labeled as hostile to collectivization. Grossman depicts what followed. Mothers and fathers wanted to save their children to put just a little grain to one side. They were told, you hate the motherland of socialism with a ferocious hatred. You want to sabotage the plan. You're nothing but vermin, you sub-kulak parasites. Terror fell upon villages. The authorities searched for that grain as if they were searching for bombs and machine guns. They stabbed the earth with bayonets and ramrods. They smashed floors and dug underneath them. They dug up vegetable gardens. Grossman's depiction is corroborated by Robert Conquest, who quotes a former activist, Lev Kopylov. I took part in this myself, scouring the countryside, searching for hidden grain, testing the earth with an iron rod for loose spots that might lead to buried grain. With the others, I emptied out the old folks' storage chests, stopping my ears to the children's crying and the women's wails. For I was convinced that I was accomplishing the great and necessary transformation of the countryside, that in the days to come the people who lived there would be better off for it. Now, finding grain was futile, since there were no silos. Instead, enforcers acted out of ignorance of farming. The grain was simply dumped on the ground with sentries standing guard all around it. And by the beginning of winter, the grain was soaking and beginning to rot. The Soviet authorities didn't have enough tarpaulins to protect the peasants' grain. There was no food. There's just more lies. When the grain was requisitioned, by the way, the party activists were told the peasants would be fed by the state. That was a lie. Not a single grain was given to the hungry. Journalist Malcolm Muggeridge, who reported in the early summer of 1933 on the devastation, was quoted by Conquest. On a recent visit to the Northern Caucasus and the Ukraine, I saw something of the battle that is going on between the government and the peasants. The battlefield is as desolate as in any war and stretches over a large part of Russia. On the one side, millions of starving peasants, their bodies often swollen from lack of food. On the other, soldier members of the GPU carrying out the instructions of the dictatorship of the proletariat. They had gone over the country like a swarm of locusts and taken away everything edible. They had shot or exiled thousands of peasants, sometimes whole villages. They had reduced some of the most fertile land in the world to a melancholy desert. Now, Grossman's depiction is heart-wrenching. No footsteps but the footsteps of famine. Famine never slept. First thing in the morning, children were crying in every hut, asking for bread. And what were their mothers to give them? Snow? There was no help to be had from anyone. The party officials just kept on repeating, you shouldn't have lazed about like that. You should have worked harder. Now, I'm going to skip ahead just because I'm running out of time here, but this essay is so worth your time. And Barry Brownstein asks you to consider, imagine if hatred were to grip our country, maybe 10 years in the future. America's mired in an economic depression. The population is further polarized. People are suffering and they're gripped by fear. A future populist president is going to need scapegoats. Would this president label the wealthy 1% or those with large retirement accounts or cryptocurrency holders as the cause of the suffering? When property is seized, what other rights crumble for us all? You get the message here, right? One's rights are only as strong as one's defense of the rights of others. So when you harbor hatred toward other people, your own humanity is destroyed. In Grossman's words, looking at his victim as other than human, he ceases to be human himself. He executes the human being inside his own self. He is his own executioner. Now, he has a great quote here from Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. I don't have time to read it, but I'll tell you, it's well worth the time. But in the midst of suffering beyond belief, the point is there's always a choice for love or hate. So let Grossman's message sink in, says Barry Brownstein. Every human being is capable of acting out of great hatred. Every human being is capable of acting out of great love. Every human being has the responsibility to choose. Our future is determined by the choices we make today. So again, not telling you what to think, but suggesting if you find yourself entertaining little spasms of hatred here and there, quickly and quietly strangle them and bury them behind the barn. They are not in your best interest.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show. This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
Hey, welcome back to the show. My thanks to Dixie Chiropractic. Sorry, that's Dr. Ward Wagner. DixieChiro.com is the website for Dixie Chiropractic, and if you or someone you love is dealing with pain, you should definitely talk to them. This is especially for my listeners in southern Utah. Car accident injuries, you bet they can help you. If you have bulging herniated discs, here's a $99 intro special, 2 treatments plus massage. If you have neuropathy, $99 Calmare treatment plus massage. You can get all the details at DixieChiro.com. When you get on the phone with them, when you're making your appointment, please let them know that you heard about this on this show. Well, the economic turbulence you may be sensing, if you don't watch the markets, you can probably still sense that things are a little bit awry economically. It's a real thing. Got a great article here from Dan Sanchez from the Foundation for Economic Education. The markets are yelling mayday. And here's why. He says an aircraft pilot about to crash will repeat the distress signal mayday. And throughout the maydays of this month so far, financial markets have been sending distress signals that may indicate an imminent crash of their own. The major stock market indices have all been experiencing steep sell-offs since May 4th, extending a decline that began around the end of March. Now, most analysts will attribute this sell-off to inflation fears, and traders aren't worried about how inflation will directly affect the economy, but how it will influence the decisions of a handful of bureaucrats. They fear that it will lead Federal Reserve officials to tighten the money spigot that's driving inflation in the first place. The Fed's money pumping has driven up prices across the board, but especially the prices of capital goods, the value of which is derived from the value of future consumption goods they will yield relative to the present consumption goods. Now, that ratio, as Austrian economists explain, is the basis for interest rates. So by distorting it with its money pumping, the Fed has artificially lowered interest rates so as to stimulate the economy. Now, this has been the Fed's standard operating procedure since its founding in 1913. But it has precipitously ramped it up since the advent of COVID in order to prop up an economy staggering under the burden of draconian governmental responses to the disease. If, as traders fear, the resulting inflation prompts the Fed to ease up on the money pumping, that will allow interest rates to rise by pulling out the props holding up capital prices at artificially high levels relative to present consumption goods. Now, this upheaval in relative prices will translate into severe losses for most businesses, revealing that, lured by the Fed's artificial stimulus, they had overextended themselves. And that general spike in market losses is what's known as a crash and a recession. Now, Dan Sanchez says Wall Street is right to expect it, but it would be wrong to push for policies to forestall it, as it often does. A recession is a tough time, but it's not a bad thing. The artificially inflated bubble, that was the bad thing. An economic bust is a necessary and beneficial repair of the economic distortion and damage that occurred during the deceptively pleasant artificial boom. The more you delay this repair, the more distortion and damage will accumulate, and the more painful later repair will have to be. Now, he's pretty blunt here. He says the bust we need will be extremely painful because the Fed has been money pumping at ever-increasing, unprecedented levels and without stint since the financial crisis of 2008. But kicking the can down the road even further will only mean an even more painful bust when the Fed finally does relent. And that's if we're lucky. If the Fed never relents, its policy will eventually result in hyperinflation, which can be a civilization killer. So Dan Sanchez says the market is crying out mayday. Let it crash, and then let it rebuild and ascend sustainably under its own power. The government got us into this mess, but only the market can get us out. And as the poets say, the only way out is through. I understand there's a fair amount of economic jargon in there that may not make sense to everybody. I'd say take on the article anyway. Look up the things you don't understand. But I think he's right. We're not going to avoid the pain on this one, so in the words of your friends in the military, embrace the suck and move through it. It's a temporary, though painful stage, but I think the correction has been a long time coming, and it appears it's on our doorstep. I don't say that to be maudlin. I don't say that to try to get you fearful. Just understand. These are consequences that have been a long time in the making, and they're not going to be avoided. So let's position ourselves as best we can, ride out the correction as best we can. And again, I'm going to hearken to the more time you spend focused on trying to help the people around you, the better it will go. All right, shifting gears. Here's another one. Watching the Great Reset unfold around us. Well, it definitely keeps things exciting. Kit Knightley says genetically edited food might just be the next stage that the architects of this reset have in store for us. This is from offguardian.org. Kit Knightley says the Queen's speech was interesting this year. For all the people outside the UK who don't understand what the Queen's speech actually is, it's a farcical state occasion in which the Queen, or in this case, Prince Charles, since Her Majesty is ill or perhaps secretly dead or having mobility issues, makes a speech about what her government intends to do for the next 12 months. Now, of course, the Queen doesn't actually write the speech or have any input on its content or have any control at all over what her government intends to do. She's just a mouthpiece in a big gold hat. It's the UK equivalent of the State of the Union, only done in Halloween costumes made out of shiny stolen rocks. But the whole thing is nothing but a grand guilt statement of intent from the British deep state, wrapped in mink and draped in medals they never earned. It's a joke, but it's worth listening to. Or if you have a sensitive stomach, you can just read the full text the next day on the UK government's website. That's what Kit Knightley does. Now, a lot of the content is entirely predictable. More money to Ukraine with a promise the UK will lead the way in championing security around the world. More online censorship via the Online Safety Bill. A compulsory register for homeschooled children via the Schools Reform Bill. And there's also mention of securing the Constitution by introducing the UK's own Bill of Rights. In fact, Kit Knightley broke down that particular Trojan horse back in February. But Kit says the part I found most interesting is the stated plan to encourage agricultural and scientific innovation at home via the proposed Genetic Technology or Precision Breeding Bill. The proposed bill, which for some reason is not available through the Parliament website, follows on from DEFRA's announced loosened regulation of genetic research back in January. To quote the National Institute of Agricultural Botany, or NIAB, the legislation would take certain precision breeding techniques out of the scope of restrictive GMO rules. Now, essentially, this would see new gene-edited foods as distinct from old-fashioned genetically modified foods, and therefore not subject to the same rules and oversight. The claimed distinction is that gene editing, as opposed to genetic modification, doesn't introduce DNA from other species. Therefore, in effect, it's merely speeding up what could potentially naturally happen over time. Now, you might think this is all just semantics, and such a law will just provide a loophole for all genetically modified foods to simply rebrand themselves as genetically edited foods, and thereby avoid regulation. But that's disgustingly cynical, and shame on you for even thinking it. All in all, this is pretty on-message stuff and not especially surprising. What's noteworthy is, by pure happenstance, I'm sure, it appears to coincide with a renewed push on the GM or genetically modified food front in other countries all over the world. In December 2021, Switzerland added an amendment to its moratorium on GMO crops, permitting the use of certain gene editing techniques. Last month, Egypt announced their new strain of genetically modified wheat. 2 days ago, Ethiopia's National Agricultural Biotechnology Research Center announced they'd researched and the country will now be growing genetically modified cotton and maize. And despite Russia's sweeping ban on the cultivation or importing of genetically modified crops, they've nonetheless created a 111 billion ruble project to create up to 30 varieties of genetically edited plants and farm animals. Now, Britain's deregulation of genetically modified food is always described as a post-Brexit move, with the EU chided around the world for its precautionary principle on genetically modified crops. And yet, as long ago as last April, the EU was calling for a rethink on GM crops. In fact, just today, European Biotechnology magazine reports the EU Commission has launched its final consultation on the deregulation of new breeding techniques in agriculture. So the questions are, why this and why now? We're seeing a sudden increase in the variety of genetically modified crops available and also a simultaneous push for deregulation of the industry in Western nations. Why would they be doing this now? Well, Kit Knightley says, well, there is a food crisis, or more accurately, they have just created a food crisis. And as the cliched Hegelian dialectic inevitably goes, their manufactured problem is now in need of their contrived solution. So we should expect to see genetic engineering pitched as a solution to our food crisis in the very near future, like yesterday, or indeed 2 months ago. That's how fast they work now, barely a pretense at concealing the plan, spitting out the answers so fast, they make it obvious they knew the question beforehand. We'll come back to Kit Knightley's article here in just a few moments. Again, it's linked in the show notes at thebryanhydeshow.com. We'll be back right after this.
This is The Bryan Hyde Show. This is The Bryan Hyde Show.
Welcome back, my fellow wrong thinker. We'll get back to Kit Knightley's article in just a moment. I want to mention lifesavingfood.com, one of my longtime sponsors here on the program, and a great resource if you are, getting serious about not just food storage, but also any other aspect of emergency preparedness, water purification, solar cooking, all that kind of stuff. You would be amazed at the tools and the various resources that are available. Now, look, it's true. The cost of everything is going up, and that includes food storage. But here's the beauty. The money you spend on food storage today is money that's going to be well spent, because this food storage comes with a 25-year shelf life. You store it properly. You got 25 years to figure out when you want to use it. And it's just possible sometime within the next 25 years. There might be some, difficult times. Unexpected things come up. Does it make sense? Click on the link I provide in my show notes under lifesavingfood.com. Just take a look. I trust you'll know what to do if you need to do something. All right, back to Kit Knightley's article about the gene-edited food, the next stage of the Great Reset. Kit asks, why would this push for deregulation of genetically modified crops or genetically edited crops be taking place right now? And the answer is that, a lot of the powers that be have created a food crisis. So we should expect to see them pitching genetic engineering as a solution to this food crisis in the very near future. In fact, he points to March 15th, when the special operation in Ukraine was less than 3 weeks old. The Times was already headlining, "War forces farmers to think about genetically modified crops," and reporting genetic modification could make Britain's food system less susceptible to geopolitical turmoil. A week later, Verdict published an article titled "Improving Food Self-Sufficiency with Genetically Modified Crops During Geopolitical Crises." And just last week, the Times of Israel asked, can gene editing help farmers satisfy the rising demand for food? 4 days ago, the Manila Times published an article, "In Times of Food Scarcity, Revisiting Genetically Modified Crops." And a couple of days ago, before the Queen's speech specifically mentioning the gene editing bill, Scotland's Press and Journal ran an opinion piece headlined, "Scottish Government Must Lift GM Crop Ban to Ease Cost of Living Crises." Yesterday, the information services company IHS Markit published an article on GM regulation in Europe in which they claimed, quote, "The Ukraine-Russia conflict has demonstrated the fragility and vulnerability of global and European food supply chains. Around the world, governments in leading agricultural producing countries are now catching up with the United States, both to better legislate gene-edited products as well as differentiate them from the older genetically modified organism technology and its negative connotations to some consumers, commentators, farmers, retailers, politicians, and lawmakers." And of course, the Genetic Literacy Project just recently published an article by Ukrainian-Canadian David Zaruk railing against the EU's precautionary principle on GMOs and calling for an embracing of new technology to prevent widespread hunger and increase food sovereignty. And it goes on and on. Oh, and let's not forget climate change, guys. Of course, it's not all about the food crisis. Giving corporate giants free rein to genetically alter all the food we eat will also be good for the planet. They talk about that a lot recently. On February 8th of this year, the University of Bonn published a new study claiming genetic engineering can have a positive effect on the climate. February 24th of this year, the Cornell-based NGO Alliance for Science published an article claiming GMOs could shrink Europe's climate footprint, based on the study mentioned above. In response to the Queen's speech, the UK's National Institute of Agriculture and Botany claimed that genetic modification will make farming more sustainable. And in a reminder that we're not just talking about crops, but genetically engineering livestock as well, in February, Deutsche Welle suggested that genetically altered climate sheep and eco-pigs could combat global heating. And 3 weeks ago, Stuff.nz asked simply, can genetic modification save the planet? So the narrative is clearly set. Genetically engineered food will save us all from the food crisis and global warming too, plus anything else they can think of. Now, the knives are out for organics, so not content with the semi-constant fluffing of the GM business, the MSM are also turning their guns on organic farming and giving it both barrels, the Wall Street Journal reports. The Ukraine crisis reveals the folly of organic farming. As food prices skyrocket, the world needs to admit it can't live without modern, efficient agriculture. The Telegraph blames organic farming policies for tipping Sri Lanka into bloody chaos. And the Alliance for Science article mentioned above goes out of its way to criticize the EU's pro-organic farm-to-fork plans, claiming organic farming has lower yields and would be associated with increases in global greenhouse gas emissions by causing land use changes elsewhere. So it looks like the West must stop organic farming to help future food crisis. That's according to Swiss newspaper NZZ am Sonntag. Adding that organic farming is worse for the planet because plowing up fields releases more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Now, we already saw wellness cults accused of peddling anti-vax conspiracy theories last year. This will easily extend to organic farmers and their customers. Also, in an interesting, again, probably totally accidental parallel, the currently simmering bird flu outbreak has also hit organic and free-range farmers hard, with one sponsored Guardian article asking if year-round bird flu could spell the end of free-range eggs. So having seen just how the COVID-19 vaccine program unfolded, it's not hard to see how the pro-genetically modified push will go from here. Genome-edited crops and farm animals are going to become the new settled science. But they'll be sold to the public as cheaper, more nutritious, better for the environment, and good for preventing future pandemics. Yeah, they literally did say that already. And of course, anyone who resists the push for gene-edited food and or mourns the planned death of organic farming will be accused of questioning the science. Now, just as we saw COVID skeptics denounced as spreading Russian disinformation despite Russia's willing complicity in the COVID lie, those who argue against genome-edited food will be said to be sharing Russian talking points or doing Putin's work for him, despite Russia being well on board the gene-editing train. Kit Knightley says it all gets very predictable from there. Organic farmers will probably be anti-vaxxer conspiracy theorist Russian spies by the end of summer. This probably explains why Bill Gates was buying up so much farmland last year, too. Interesting. I've got a link to the article, lots of links within the article. If you really want to dig deep into this topic, you have the opportunity to do so. Well, I don't know if you are familiar with the name Randy Weaver. If I said Ruby Ridge, Idaho, that would probably spark a memory for a lot of folks, but it's been 30 years since the federal government killed Randy Weaver's son and his wife and tried to put Randy in prison for life. An Idaho jury, upon hearing the facts of the case, acquitted Randy on just about every charge. The only thing I think he was actually found guilty of was a failure to appear charge, which it's debatable whether that was really his fault or not, since he was given a wrong court date. His friend Kevin Harris, who was standing trial for murdering a U.S. Marshal, was actually acquitted. The shooting was ruled self-defense. Did government ever apologize? Well, not exactly. It did pay Randy and his surviving children a fairly healthy multi-million-dollar settlement. And the sad thing here is what most people know about Randy Weaver is whatever they learned through the mainstream media. Oh, well, he was a member of the Aryan Nations. Not true, by the way. He was a white supremacist. Not true. He may have been a separatist in the sense that he really didn't want whatever urban life has to offer. That just wasn't for him, and that's why he had moved his family to Ruby Ridge up in northern Idaho. But there's so much to this story which is conveniently left out. And that's why I'm linking in today's show notes to an article from James Bovard on why Ruby Ridge is not forgotten. And I'm going to ask you to please, if you don't know much about the story, please take a look and let Jim Bovard connect some of these dots for you so that you can see for yourself just what the government did to set in motion this series of events that ended in the deaths of 3 people and a terrible, miscarriage of justice in the sense that, well, at least they kept us safe. No, they didn't. They did not. And we shouldn't be fooled into thinking that they did. The FBI has become more powerful, more dangerous since Ruby Ridge. And the lesson that you can take away from this is Randy Weaver may have been on some people's radar screens as well. He's not a very desirable guy. People I know who met him, I actually knew his, I think it was his nephew, said he was a very down-to-earth, very humble guy. Not nearly the racist monster that the mainstream media tried to paint, but even if he was a racist monster, let's say he was everything that the media tried to portray him as, a one-dimensional cartoon who hated anybody who wasn't his color, it still wouldn't make it right for the feds to do what they did to him and to his family. So I hope Randy Weaver is at peace, safely reunited with his wife and his son. But the important lesson is none of this had to happen.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show.